If you've got a Bible, I want to invite you to open it up to Luke chapter 24. We've been walking through a series called A Better Way, and we've been looking at different ways in which Jesus calls us to things that are different than the ways that our culture calls us to. And so we started a few weeks back. We talked about the gracious calling that Jesus, his invitation to follow him is rooted and grounded in grace. And then the following week, we talked about disciplined freedom, how our culture and our world is obsessed with this thing called freedom. We celebrate it. In many cases, we worship it. But that what Jesus invites us into is to be free from all of these other ways of living, but to submit ourselves to the way that he leads us and guides us. And part of that is living in a way that is disciplined, that is not just simply living by our urges and impulses and our wants and desires, but rather about having our wants and desires be changed and transformed by Jesus so that we would embody what he's about. And then last week, we had Elizabeth Miller here who did an amazing job. Go back and rewatch the sermon, but that had nothing to do with our series, although in a lot of ways it has a lot to do with our series. And she talked about just how do we navigate the transformative power of the Holy Spirit and what Jesus invites us into in the midst of all the brokenness we see in our world. This morning, I want to talk about a term I call prophetic hope. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on this morning, prophetic hope. Two different words that often we talk about separate from each other, but I think that both need to be together. And as followers of Jesus, we want to always hold these two things together. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I want to begin by simply talking about a word that I think is an incredible symptom of our culture in which we live. And I know it's something that so easily creeps into my own heart, and I simply want to share it with you this morning. That is the word cynicism. The word cynicism. When we think about the word cynicism, maybe you think about the people who are online, who are constantly saying put downs, saying mean, negative things towards other people. Maybe there's a specific person in your life who is always there with the snarky comment. We live in a culture that is incredibly cynical. One that does not want to put a lot of hope in anything, does not usually want to invest in anything because we've been constantly let down over and over and over again. It's been interesting to watch cynicism become more and more a part of our conversation and our attitude as we engage with each other in our culture, whether it's online, whether it's in TV media, and whether it's people just interacting with each other at the table. It's been fascinating to see the way in which cynicism has become an important part or a significant part of how people interact. I've even noticed it in the way that sometimes I find myself talking about things because knowing I'm talking to someone and they may have a very different opinion of something and they may suddenly come with a tear down or a put down for that thing that I suggest or maybe bring up that I like. And so I usually will kind of backpedal a little bit when I say that, oh, we really enjoyed this movie. That was us, though, not maybe you. I don't know if you ever find yourself saying these kinds of things, and often it is because I am preemptively wanting to make sure that, hey, maybe this person didn't like this, or maybe they're going to come and insult the thing that I just said that I liked, and so I want to be cautious with how I present it. In the Christian church, we've often talked about doubt, and I might just simply say doubt is when we're saying, or doubt says it's hard to believe. But when we talk about what cynicism is, I'd say this: cynicism says it's hard to care. And for many of us, we've walked through disappointment and hurt. We've been let down over and over again, whether it is religious leaders, whether it is political leaders, whether it is movie stars or creatives that we invested our time and energy in consuming the things that they were creating. Maybe it was institutions that we thought, oh, this is going to solve all of the world's problems, and yet it didn't. It has been fascinating even to watch a deep-seated cynicism begin to emerge about the scientific world. And I say all of this very carefully, not trying to put forth any argument, but it has been fascinating to me to see different heroes within the scientific world, specifically people like Dr. Fauci and all the stuff that happened coming out of the pandemic, and now the deep cynicism that is held for many people within the scientific world. And the debates that we're seeing our culture currently have in news media and in various different other print media. And so I just think that is a fascinating thing, and it is a symptom of a deeper issue, which is not just that simply we live in a cynical world, it's because we live in a world that is full of despair. one that has walked through so much disappointment, one that has walked through so much hurt, which has seen the heroes fall time and time again, and it's really hard to care and invest in anything because we know that ultimately it is going to let us down. And I've watched this in the church, and I've watched this in my own life and my own heart. I want to commit myself to becoming more like Jesus, to care about the things that he cares about, to love the things that he loves, and to love the way that he loves. And I hope that in my own life, as people look at me, that they would see Jesus. But I have noticed at different times that I'm becoming less looking like Jesus, and I'm starting to look more and more like these guys. I got a picture. And I'm not just saying that because I'm getting older. I'm saying that also because of just, I want to sit up in the peanut gallery, far removed, not invested, and just simply hurl my criticisms and my comments and point out everything that is wrong with everything. Do you have people in your life like this? Maybe more significantly, do you have moments in your life like this, where you simply want to just retreat, pull away? Maybe it's out of hurt, maybe it's out of disappointment. Maybe it's because you heard something, you're like, I don't know, this doesn't line up, and so you just want to remove yourself from it and just put it down. And maybe you don't actually say the comments out loud. Maybe no one knows them, but they're happening inside your head and they're happening inside your heart. I think our culture has a cynicism problem. I think that the church has a cynicism problem, and I know in my own heart I have a cynicism problem. And yet Jesus invites us into a better way. And I believe one of the ways in which we are able to confront this cynicism, which so easily creeps and seeps into our own hearts and our own lives, is something that Jesus offers us, which I would call prophetic hope. And so this morning, I want to look at a text and I want to talk about what does it mean to be people who are committed to prophetic hope. And so maybe the first thing I should just simply say is, what is prophetic hope? And then we're going to look at this passage, and I'm going to show the way in which Jesus invites his followers into prophetic hope, and what Jesus essentially, not only that he offers us prophetic hope, and that he invites us into it. So first off, I would just simply say this. To say what prophetic hope is, a lot of the time we think about hope as just being simple optimism, thinking things are going to turn out great. And the reason why we put a prophetic in front of that is because this is not just simply some sort of blind, naive optimism that people and institutions and everything in the world is just ultimately going to turn out going well. Rather, prophetic hope is to hold up the hope that we have that Jesus offers us, that Jesus offered us through his teaching, that Jesus offered us through his embodied way of life, that Jesus offers us through the cross and through the resurrection. And the hope that we have is the Holy Spirit is working within us and that is making all things new, both within our own hearts and throughout the entire world. Prophetic hope is not just, oh yeah, everything's going to work out. Everything's going to be okay. Rather, prophetic hope says, no, the world is a mess. There's a lot of brokenness, and yet Jesus has conquered over all of it. So if you've got a Bible, Luke chapter 24, we're going to start at verse 9, just to give some quick context. Jesus has been crucified. He's been buried. Some women, his followers, have gone to the tomb. All the other disciples have scattered. They've gone to the tomb to go and to anoint the body. And here's what happens. They come, they encounter an angel who says, Jesus isn't here, he's risen. And they're all kind of like, wow, that was amazing. And so they go and they begin to start to go and tell people. Here's picking up of them and kind of their response to encountering this angel and this message that Jesus is alive and that the tomb is empty. And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11, that's being the disciples, and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Now that term idle tale, it just sounds kind of like nice. Maybe another word that we say is nonsense. They thought that this was rubbish. These other disciples, they hear that the tomb is empty, that Jesus is alive, and their just response is, no. I actually love one commentator in his commentary on the Gospel of Luke. He translated his idle tale as the word twaddle. which is just, to me, is like the greatest word. He just says, it's twaddle, it's garbage, it's nonsense, it's rubbish. They did not believe them. Now, it seems that Peter, he seemed to think something more was going on, but we're going to skip ahead just one verse, and we're going to pick up with two men who are on their way to a road or to a town called Emmaus. Starting at verse 13, that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Quick little bit of context just to kind of understand what's going on in the hearts and minds of these two men who are making this journey, this 7-mile journey to Emmaus. Now, what we would probably assume is just a few hours before, because the text goes out of its way to tell us it was the same day. These women have come. Jesus is alive. The tomb is empty. You would think that even if there was a smidgen of hope that this was true, that you're going to stick around. You want to be around Jerusalem because Jesus is alive, or maybe, potentially, maybe there's just even a hint of it. And yet these two disciples, so overwhelmed in cynicism and despair, I mean, where do they go? Do they stick around? Do they go, oh, maybe we should talk with some of the other disciples to figure out what's going on here? Maybe we should do some investigating ourselves. Maybe we should discuss this with the women, try and find out what's going on here. No, their response is they leave. They give up. They're out of there. They're on their way out of the city, 7 miles away. I don't know what was going on in Emmaus, but it can't be too important. You'd think it'd be worth at least waiting a few extra hours for. But they're done with it. They're leaving in their despair and their sadness and their cynicism. And as they walk, they are discussing this and venting and lamenting together. And it says that Jesus suddenly showed up to them, but they didn't see him. They didn't recognize him. Well, picking things back up at verse 17. And he said to them, he being Jesus, what is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk? And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And I love Jesus, like he gets all this snarky answer from this guy. And then he says, what things? And they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things have happened. So he said, we had all of this hope in this guy, that one day he was going to raise Israel up to return back to this mighty military force that had been throughout history and reestablish it as God's holy city, which was supposed to be a light to all the other nations. He was going to make Israel great again, and he had this deep-seated belief going, that's what Jesus was supposed to do. And then when that didn't happen, their world fell apart. Our disciple continues on. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb. And when it says amazed, it could be flabbergasted. It's not like amazed, like, oh, wow, those women are incredible. It was that what amazing news to hear. It was just, they've said this stuff and we think it sounds insane. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he was going further, but they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And so we have these two disciples on a journey. They're heartbroken. They're in despair. Their world has fallen apart. And they encounter Jesus on a road. And not only do they undergo this incredible physical journey with him, but they undergo a spiritual journey as well as their eyes are open. A few things that I think that Jesus is saying to them and to us through this passage that I want to point out. The first thing that I think is important for us to understand about prophetic hope and having prophetic hope in a world where it is so easy to fall into cynicism and despair is that Jesus meets us in our despair and our cynicism. You'll just notice, actually, going back, verse 17, and he said to them, "What is this conversation you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still looking sad. They're blinded. They don't see that Jesus is there, but Jesus is right there present with them, engaging them, wanting them to enter into relationship, wanting them to see who he is and what he's done and that he is alive and at work. Jesus meets them in their despair and in their cynicism. Jesus doesn't just show up to the disciples who believe right away. Jesus doesn't just show up to the ones who we've got it all together. And I would say this too, that Jesus doesn't just show up to people who have it all together, who are suddenly in this hopeful disposition of just, yay, everything is great and wonderful. No, Jesus shows up in the midst of the situations where our world is falling apart. And Jesus engages them with a question and invites them to see things differently. Going back to verse 17, he engages them with the question. He said to them, "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" Now, the fascinating thing is that when it comes to cynicism, I have found that if you want to grow in your cynicism, hang out with other people who are cynical. In fact, actually, one of the most fascinating things about cynicism is the way in which it alienates us from others. And the kind of community that is forged through cynicism is always one that is united around negativity. Maybe you've encountered this in your own life, right? We see this online all the time. In fact, this is probably 98% of the internet. It's just negative people finding other negative people and just railing on stuff. Just making fun of it, of trashing it, putting it down, pointing out all the things that are wrong in it. Jesus encounters these two men who are having these conversations, just probably this echo chamber of despair. And Jesus, he meets us in that place, but he asks us a question and invites us to go, what's really going on here? A.J. Swoboda, who is a theologian and philosopher, in his book After Doubt, he talks about the significant way in which, for so many of us, cynicism can creep in and a negativity can creep in. And instead of actually trying to build and move things towards constructive answers, we just want to focus on the negativity. He writes this in his book. It can be a way, and this is he talks about cynicism and our approach. It can be our way of entering a conversation without having to have any answers. We can take the time to build, construct beautiful and worthwhile beliefs. We only have time to pull others down. We don't take the time to build, construct beautiful and worthwhile beliefs. Sorry, I read that twice over. But I think it's true both times. So often it can be so easy to tear things down, right? Maybe you have someone in your life and they're just so good at pointing out all the things that are wrong with something. But if you just simply ask, hey, could you come and point out a better way to do this? And they're quiet. Actually, maybe I should flip it. I know I am really good at pointing out all the things that are wrong, but the moment that someone asks me, hey, could you come and help make this better? I'm at a loss for words, and I don't know what to do. Jesus meets us in our despair and our cynicism, and he gives us a question. This question is, how are you going to respond to this? Actually, first he asks, what are you talking about? What's going on? Is it just talk? I think that that's what's so important about knowing when we talk about prophetic hope. Prophetic hope, these two things go together. First off, the prophetic, which is this idea to speak the truth in line with what God calls us to in the world that God is creating. And hope, which is about looking towards that hope. And that's why these two things always need to be held hand in hand. If you have one without the other, it always ends in problems. I just say this, the prophetic without hope is dead-end criticism. Right? We know that. There's all sorts of people who are really good at complaining and pointing out everything that is all wrong in the world. Prophetic without hope is dead-end criticism, and hope without the prophetic is dishonest. And so we need to be able to hold both of those things together. Jesus does not correct these two disciples because he says you've got all the facts wrong. He says it because you're not looking at the bigger picture that's really going on here. But the incredible hope that we have is that Jesus meets us in our despair and our cynicism. Number two, Jesus points them to the greater story that God is telling. Verse 27, Jesus gets them together. He kind of confronts them in the midst of their cynicism. He asks them questions in the midst of their cynicism. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. He essentially says, you thought this, but you really need to realize when you saw Jesus crucified on the cross, you thought that it was over. When you saw Jesus put to death and buried, you thought that, just the whole movement was shut down and that God clearly did not have anything to do with this. And yet Jesus is saying, no, wait a minute, that was actually God's idea from the beginning. That this saving, transformative work that God wanted to do in the world and in his people was then that was going to ultimately come and happen through the one who was going to suffer and die. The one who was going to reconcile a wayward creation back to the Creator. He points them to the bigger story. He invites them not just to focus on the specific little details, but invites them to see it through a bigger lens. Jesus points them to the greater story that God is telling. And one of the things that we so often need to do ourselves when we're faced with cynicism and we're faced with despair, when we're navigating disappointment and people letting us down or institutions letting us down or leaders letting us down, is we need to actually return back to, hey, what is the bigger story that God is doing here? Because I can focus on all of the human failures, but what I'm actually being called to is to focus on the greater thing that God has done and that God is doing. The final point just for this morning, I simply want to say this, is Jesus invites them, the two disciples, to rethink their place in that story. So not only is he saying, hey, there's a bigger story going on, the reconciliation of all creation, God making all things new, he also says you need to rethink where you fit. What have you gotten wrong in the midst of this? Luke 24:21, the disciples, they share with Jesus before they realize he's Jesus. They say, but we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. I love that line, but we had hoped. You can just hear the disappointment, the sadness, the despair in their lines, in their words. So we had hoped, we put all our hopes on this, that this was going to be what redeems Israel. And for them, that redemption looked like military domination. That meant a picture of freedom. That looked like a picture of exaltation. It looked like things working out the way that they wanted them to all work out. We had hoped, we had a very specific picture of how things were supposed to be and work, and yet Jesus challenges them to rethink what they're hoping for. Verse 25, "O foolish ones," Jesus responding to them, "and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" For them, there is this picture of Jesus came to do what we wanted him to do. And Jesus says, no, wait, you had such a small picture of what God's transformative, redemptive power is really all about. And it is not one that comes to meet all of your needs, because this is a Savior, this is a Messiah who did not come to have all of his needs met, but rather came to suffer these things and to enter into his glory. And I love that Jesus uses the word glory because for these disciples, when they're thinking about glory and they're thinking about God's glory, they're thinking about a city that's better than everything else, that is dominating its enemies. And yet Jesus says, no, that's not what God is actually like. And that's not what it means to live in tune with the heart of God. Rather, it is an invitation to suffer for others. And it's in Jesus' suffering on the cross and ultimately his death that he is raised up in resurrection, and that's where we see his glory made perfect in his perfect love, sacrificed on the cross. We had hoped. They have this limited picture. Essentially, they put themselves at the center of the story. It's about what we want. For them, it was about a nation. For us, it's often about an individual. They had their own sense of what they were hoping in. And Jesus says, no, you weren't hoping in God. You were hoping in the nation state. You were putting it forward. You're all about Israel when he says, no, you need to realize this was about God and God working out his saving work in the world. Jesus enters into the mess. He suffers. And it's in his willingness to graciously suffer that we see his perfect love. And in that, God is glorified. And the calling for us as people who live prophetic hope is not to remove ourselves from the brokenness and suffering that we see, and despair that we see in the world around us. Rather, it is to enter into it. A few weeks ago, we heard the stories about people from our community who've gone up to Muskrat Dam, who are present in places of despair and darkness and hurt and pain. And for them, they entered into it in the same way that Jesus enters into things. And they went and they pointed people to Jesus, and they themselves were a glimpse of the hope that we have in him. The calling to all of us to have prophetic hope is not just simply to drive out the cynicism in our own hearts, but rather to go into our world and to be present where things are at their most despair and most difficult, and to be willing to suffer in the midst of those challenges, knowing that it is painting a picture of what God is about and what God cares for. I just simply think of it this way. Prophetic hope is never up and over. Prophetic hope is never about avoiding all of the difficult and painful things that we experience in this world. Rather, prophetic hope is always down and through. Prophetic hope is about entering into the pain and suffering we see in our world and saying, Jesus has conquered this too. Jesus invites them and he invites us to rethink their place in the greater story that God is telling. Well, as we come to a conclusion in this message, one of the things that I've been reflecting on and thinking about is, what does it mean to be prophetic hope in our world? And how do we embody this and live this? And one of the practices that I've been thinking about is just something as we're working through in our family, and I'm trying to work through even in my own life, is something that I don't call it this, but I think it's a helpful way. It's someone else much smarter than I came up with this, is the practice of celebration. I mean, when we think about what we celebrate within our lives, within our community, maybe within your family or with your friends, what are the things that you celebrate? Because we live in a culture where it is so easy to fall into cynicism. And so when we're cynical about things, very rarely are we willing to celebrate things and to praise things. But when we celebrate something, we take a risk and we say, this thing is good and awesome, and we think it is worth enjoying and having fun in honor of this thing. If you were to ask us in our family, what are the things that we celebrate? Well, we celebrate birthdays and we celebrate holidays. And one of the things that we're realizing is that, what are we telling our kids by the things that we celebrate? We celebrate good grades. Maybe we celebrate sports victories. Or if you were to look at just my life and the conversations that I have with other people, who are the people in my life that I go out of my way to celebrate with our family? I mean, we don't throw them parties, but I talk about them. I praise them. And if you were to come into our household, I praise a lot of sports athletes. Those are things that I like, oh, wow, you should have seen the game last night, or whatever it is. This player was incredible. And maybe the question we need to ask ourselves as both individuals and as a church corporately, what are the things that we celebrate? Do we celebrate the people whose careers just keep making more and more money, or do we celebrate the people who are constantly faithful to Jesus, maybe even calls them away from making more and more money and to go and to serve the needy? Do we celebrate generosity or do we celebrate success? Do we celebrate accomplishments that our whole world looks at and goes, oh yeah, that's something to celebrate? Or do we celebrate the things that look a lot more Jesus-like? More recently, I was talking with another pastor, and he was saying he had to leave a little bit early because they were going to be having a service and a celebration for a person in their congregation. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Like, what were they doing? He said, actually, this person has just navigated a number of they've been on a significant spiritual journey, but one of the things they've discerned and learned throughout this journey is that God is calling them to singleness and to celibacy. And so they want to be faithful to live with sexual integrity, and so they've committed their lives to Jesus in this way, that they are not going to be having sex with anyone else, and that they're just going to pursue their relationship with Jesus rather than pursuing relationships with other people. And I kind of went, wow, that's interesting. He said, yeah, so we're going to have like a big celebration for this person. We're going to have a service to pray for them and to bless them, and then we're going to celebrate them because they've listened and discerned and they are choosing to follow Jesus rather than to follow all of the different desires in this world. And all I could think is, as I was hearing that, now that may sound weird and strange. Yes, totally get it. But all I could think was, as I was hearing this, is like, wow, they are celebrating something so counter to our world. They are celebrating a different way of living, not one that pursues what culture would tell us should be your wants and your desires, the things that you make your life all about, but rather this is a person who is so committed to Jesus. They are putting aside some of the things that our culture holds up as being the most highest and esteemed things, and they are going to throw a party, an awesome party for this person because they are celebrating their commitment to follow Jesus. In a culture that can so easily fall into cynicism, and we as a church can so easily follow along, the invitation is to practice prophetic hope, to enter into the darkest places and point to what Jesus has done, and for us to not make ourselves the center of that hope or an institution or anything else, but rather to make Jesus the very center and grounding for that hope. And one of the ways that we can fight that is through the practice of celebration. Celebrating the things that Jesus celebrates. So we transition to the communion table. I'd be amiss if I didn't finish kind of where this story goes. We read through it, but I want to come back to it. These men have this encounter with Jesus in their hopelessness, in their sadness, in their despair. And suddenly Jesus is pointing them in the right direction. You can see like their hearts begin to kind of tweak and change and like, oh, maybe things aren't quite as hopeless as we thought. And then this interesting thing happens starting at verse 30. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread, he blessed it and broke it and gave it to them, and their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. There's this amazing moment where they gather together, they begin to share food from the table together, and they have this amazing eye-opening experience. Oh, wait a minute. We were so lost and caught in our own despair, and suddenly we didn't realize Jesus was here, present with us this entire time. And so my invitation to you, as you come to the communion table this morning, maybe you wrestle with cynicism. Maybe it's frustration, despair. Maybe it's in churches. Maybe it's in Christians in North America. Maybe it's in frustrations about the things that God, would you hurry up and do this? Would you hurry up and make things right? And the invitation is to come and just open up your heart and just say, Jesus, would you be my prophetic hope? Would I be responding to your truth? Would I be responding to your future and your transformative work? Logistically, here's how it's going to work. We're going to have 2 people at the back, 2 service areas at the back, and 2 at the front. We're going to have the band come up and play some music. And as the band is playing, you are welcome to sit, just take some time to reflect, and when you feel ready to either come forward or to go back and receive communion. Just logistically, we would invite you to walk down the center aisles, and if you're going to the back, to head out to the side aisles. Just makes traffic flow a little bit easier for us. And also, we realize that for some, we have pre-made cups that are wrapped. And so for some people, those are a gluten-free option for those of you who need that here, or for those who have to be a little more careful just around just wanting for sanitary reasons. But the invitation is that when you feel ready to come up to receive it, and invite you to bring it back to your spot and to hold on to it. And then once we're done singing, I will come up and we will all share communion together. So invite the band to come forward, and let me pray as they're doing that. Gracious God, you are our hope. In a world that often feels overwhelming, we are so thankful for your victory through your life, through your death, and through your resurrection. And as we come to the table this morning and as we receive what you have done, your sacrifice, your forgiveness, your invitation to know you and walk with you, I pray that our eyes would be opened. For those of us who are walking through seasons of cynicism and despair, Lord, would you soften our hearts? Would you make us aware that you're there? We thank you for your grace and for your mercy. In Jesus' name, amen.